So in modern scholarship, Liburnians are identified as the ethnic group that lived on the territory of modern-day Croatia. As an entity with a high level of archaeological congruence, Liburnians can be archaeologically traced back to the late Bronze and the early Iron Age on a territory that spreads roughly in what is today northern Dalmatia. Good, thank you. So northern Dalmatia and some Quarnero Islands. However, based on various statements in literary sources, many scholars tend to interpret that Liburni ruled over a broader space, particularly during the early Iron Age. These hypotheses are based on testimonies of ancient authors such as Skimnos of Chios, Theopompus, and Apollonius of Rhodes, who claimed that many central Dalmatian islands belonged to Liburni as well. Moreover, during the Roman times, ancient Liburnian maritime supremacy was even more emphasized. For instance, Strabo in the 1st century BC claimed that Liburni occupied Corcyra before its colonization by the Corinthians in the 733 BC. In addition to that, Appian states that Liburni occupied Epidamnus before being expelled by the Corcyrians in 627 BC. All aforementioned statements led scholars to conclude that Liburni ruled over much of the eastern and western Adriatic coasts from around 800 to 400 BCE. And this concept is frequently repeated in the scholarly literature, and it is known as the Liburnian thalassocracy. Today, it's a really widely accepted concept, and thanks to a book written by John Wilkes, Dalmatia, that is frequently quoted in scholarly literature, it's actually a concept that you can find reproduced everywhere. The Liburnian thalassocracy is closely intertwined with the idea of regional piracy. The support for the hypothesis derives from later Roman literary sources, chiefly Livy and Appian. The first one described the venture of the Spartan king, who accidentally ended up in the Adriatic. The place was described as a dangerous one, mainly due to the Liburnian, Histrian, and Illyrian tribes notorious for their savagery on the sea. To this account, one can add several Appian's testimonies who made general comments about Liburnian pirate raids as well. Hence, contemporary scholarship tends to observe foreign archaeological objects, particularly the ones of Greek origin, as an outcome of maritime raids. For instance, piracy is frequently emphasized as the most probable way of acquiring Middle and Late Corinthian or Italo-Corinthian vases found on the eastern Adriatic shore. In addition, a closer look at the map reveals sites where the aforementioned sherds or some of the vases that are mostly not complete ones, where they were found, but many are still not properly explored or excavated, so not much is known about their exact context. For instance, the ones shown on the slide are considered to be from Copila on the island of Korčula, so these ones that you can see here, and Copila and the island of Korčula is located right here, but their exact origin is still questionable. The good thing and I'd say the positive side is that in past 5 years, we are having more and more of them, and we'll be conducting a field survey on the island of Vis in 2 weeks, so fingers crossed. The recent excavations in Zadar, right here, which was ancient Yader, and probably the leading Liburnian site, judged primarily on the size, location, and political role of the place in later history, show a significant number of Greek material and immediately challenge the hypothesis that all objects should be defined as a result of maritime raid activities. The phenomenon that is frequently overlooked in historical overviews is the prehistoric network of trans-Adriatic connections mostly because between the prehistoric and classical archaeology studies, there is unfortunately still a visible gap. By that, I mean that usually, the ones who deal with prehistory don't read what is done in classical and vice versa. The circulation of the indigenous material shows a well-established pattern. During the early Iron Age, Liburnian trade with the opposite Italian coast is attested by numerous finds, especially ones from the region of Picenum and Daunia. Many of the Liburnian sites brought to light pieces of Daunian geometric pottery. Their amount and spread clearly show that piracy could not be the only Liburnian modus operandi, but there was more, and it seems like a proper maritime trade. These two examples, so connections with Daunia and the region of Picenum, so they're often overlooked in the literature and clearly reveal the mechanism of the trans-Adriatic trade network, and then consequently challenge the hypothesis of the prevailing Liburnian thalassocracy in the Adriatic. It would be overambitious to suggest that Liburnians were the only ones responsible for dispersing the Daunian ware or similar circum-Adriatic objects in the whole area. This argument can be further strengthened by written testimonies and depictions of novillara stelae from Picenum, which clearly reveal the maritime character of the Western Adriatic peoples. Moreover, during the second half of the 6th century BC, the Greeks founded two settlements in the northern Adriatic. Those were Adria and Spina, whose economic activities can be recognized by immense Attic imports during the 5th century BC, as well as by written testimonies. Since the maritime trade continuously flowed, it is difficult to assume that Liburnian, Histrian, or Illyrian pirate raids were a constant threat, especially on maritime routes that flowed through central Adriatic, as this map here shows. It's an estimation, of course. Now, finally, at the beginning of the 4th century BC, Syracusans and Parians established the first two permanent settlements on the eastern Adriatic coast. It was Issa on the island of Vis and Pharos on the island of Hvar. The permanent Greek presence in the eastern Adriatic meant a shift in power and trading balance. The earliest encounter of newly settled Greeks with Liburnians reflect probable animosities, as several epigraphic and literary sources indicate. The most famous is the so-called Pharian tropeum, which mentions Yadasini or Yadastini, depending on the reading of this inscription. According to one interpretation, the Liburnians from Yadar. Moreover, several decades after the foundation of Issa and Pharos, piracy was explicitly emphasized by Diodorus, who left a note about the establishment of two other unnamed apoikias in Apulia. And the reason was that the barbarians who dwelt along the coast were accustomed to put out in numerous pirate ships and render the whole shore along the Adriatic Sea, and it was unsafe for merchants. Only 50 years after that, Liburnian piracy appears in the context of Cleomenes's sailing venture in the Adriatic in aforementioned Livy's account. However, the analysis of archaeological material found along the eastern Adriatic, sites done by Luciana Szeszlin in her PhD thesis, suggests ongoing trade connections that flourished during the 3rd and the 2nd century BC. Again, many Greek imports found on various Liburnian sites clearly show their number superseded the category of isolated sea raids. At the same time, one can follow a clear increase in Roman interest in the eastern Adriatic trade. During the second half of the 3rd century, maritime raids were frequently attributed to the indigenous people, but this time not to the Liburnians, but to the RDA, an Illyrian stock that dwelt south of the Liburnian territory. RDA became notorious for their piracy during the reign of Queen Teuta in the 20s of the 3rd century BC. And maybe it was not accidental that Roman writer Florus equated Liburnians to the RDA, emphasizing their crimes on the sea. In the following 2 centuries, Liburnians are almost completely omitted from the Roman written sources, and many scholars support the idea of Liburnian collaboration with the Roman side, while the Illyrians and Delmati took the role of the most ferocious rivals. Finally, Liburnian piracy sprang out again in the 30s of the 1st century BCE, when Octavian deprived the Liburnians of their ships because they practiced piracy. Now, let's stress the crucial guidelines. One can immediately agree it is difficult to judge the scope of Liburnian piracy based only on the written and archaeological pieces of evidence. Firstly, to interpret pirate raids exclusively on archaeological material seems misleading. Even a small amount of foreign luxurious goods could always have different origins, either a direct trade, intermediary exchange, a tribute, piracy, whatever. Now, based on archaeological research conducted so far, not a single Liburnian site can be described as a proper pirate lair. Secondly, relying simply on the written sources also seems misleading. The survivorship bias of the historical sources that regularly highlight the most important historical episodes should also be taken into account. Moreover, a small number of written sources cannot serve as the main support for interpreting the frequency of pirate attacks. However, the scholarly literature has brought forward so far 2 opposite hypotheses. The first one, that was emphasized by H.J. Dell in 1967, supports the idea of piracy as an endemic habit of a local, or actually kind of a local economic pattern. According to Dell, Liburnians had always been pirates due to periodical shortages in basic supplies and commodities. Hence, pirate raids were more or less constant, and piracy on the larger level was typical in extraordinary historical circumstances, such as the rise in the Eastern Adriatic trading activities. On the other hypothesis supports ups and downs in pirate activities depending on the level of trade, cooperation, and political circumstances. For instance, during the so-called Hellenistic period, and deliberately I call it here the so-called because the Hellenistic in the Adriatic is not the same as Hellenistic in Greece and in the East, Liburnians were collaborating with Greeks and Romans, so pirate activities were difficult to expect. Now, more detailed guidelines that are often neglected in historical and archaeological discussions can be glimpsed from the general geographical, economic, and social characteristics of the Eastern Adriatic. To better comprehend the emergence and conditions of Liburnian piracy, one should immerse in these 3 basic categories. Well, the first, of course, is geography. A very well-indented coast, as well as numerous islands of northern Dalmatia and Quarnera region, which is the core of the Liburnian territory, seems like a perfect setting for maritime raids. It should serve as a fundamental background for every discussion on Liburnian piracy with a reason. Although, unfortunately, never directly connected with piracy in historical accounts, some Greek geographers emphasize the vast number of islands along the Eastern Adriatic coast, and the most obvious one is Pseudo-Skymnes, who equated the Liburnian to the Cycladic archipelago, and it's a very good connection with the previous lecture we heard. Now, the other category is, of course, economy. Now, karst relief that dominates most of northern Dalmatia and the Quarnera region is a very, very scarce terrain. The most distinctive features are lack of fertile land, confined springs of potable water, and general scarcity of life resources. All these serve as a good argument for potential short of or long-term shortages. That could build up the idea of pirate raids as frequent activities with the goal of strengthening the local economy, especially in a shelter of well-indented coast where raids could have been sudden, swift, and unexpected. And finally, the third pillar should be society. Geographical and economic conditions undoubtedly influence the development of Liburnian society. Coastal Liburnian communities can simply be described as maritime or seaprone. As Irad Malkin defined it, maritime people should be the ones who make their living from the sea and use it as a bridge to other shores. The sea is a cardinal part of their everyday life. Therefore, one can expect a sort of maritime monopolization of space, which was frequently carried out through piracy or sudden sea raids. No wonder that one of the most frequent Liburnian features that appear in historical accounts is the utility of their fast naval ships called Liburni or Liburnicae. In addition to the maritime character, the eastern Adriatic coast was politically well segmented. Although for earlier periods this can only be speculated about, Pliny the Elder is the first to directly point out the division of Liburnian society into 14 separate communities. The absence of a central authority could consequently create anarchy at sea, where there was no one to guarantee safety while trading or just simply sailing. Although not directly related to the Liburnians, a similar case appears in the same region in the narrative of the 3rd century BC, which testifies to the weakness of the regional central authority and its connection to the regional Illyrian piracy. Namely, having received the Roman delegation, the Illyrian queen Teuta replied to the Roman envoys that it was not customary for the Illyrian kings to hinder their subjects from piracy. And in conclusion, although the Liburnians are not the only ones in the Adriatic who have often been labeled as vicious pirates, it should be noted that by observing their coastal living space and environment, piracy emerges as one of the logical activities. Although many scholars prefer to emphasize the Greek and Roman demonization of Liburnians as a plausible option, it seems justified to presuppose a strong economic and social base for frequent sea raids. Nevertheless, the notion of the Liburnian thalassocracy and its connection to far-flung and frequent piracy in the whole Adriatic Gulf, or Corpus Adriaticos, should, in my opinion, be observed with caution, mostly due to the maritime character of the circum-Adriatic peoples, such as Peuqueti, Iapygians, Daunians, Histrians, or later Etruscans, recognizable not only in piracy, but frequent trans-Adriatic exchange. So in conclusion, piracy, yes, but more probably limited to the Liburnian ecosphere or coastal belt marked by a highly dented coast, followed by a confined economic background and a very politically fragmented society. By observing this framework from a broader historical perspective, Liburnian piracy and maritime dominance seem to be one of the valid arguments, not only for labeling the Eastern Adriatic as a dangerous place, which was described as such by lots of ancient authors, but also for a longer absence of permanent Greek settlements in the Eastern Adriatic. And when we talk about chronology, it lasted all up to the beginning of the 4th century BC, when Issa and Pharos were finally founded as the permanent Greek settlements. Thank you so much for your attention.